It's a great honor for me to be with you tonight, to be honoring someone who obviously played an important, positive, and pivotal role in the history of this law school at the University of Strathclyde. I'm also honored, given all the other illustrious speakers. Coming up to Scotland, though, for me, I do want to just mention one other person from my biography that Genevieve didn't. I was extremely privileged to clerk for 1 year to Justice Bertha Wilson of the Supreme Court. As you may know, Justice Wilson was the first woman on the Canadian Supreme Court. She was from Kirkcaldy, Scotland, and suffice it to say, my conscience speaks with a Scottish accent. So I also want to recall her as well as Robert Burgess tonight. So my topic tonight is the Islamic State effect, counterterrorism at the Crossroads. And as Genevieve told you, the 9/11 fallout was something that I spent many years since 9/11 trying to understand, not only in my country, but throughout the world. And I agree with Genevieve that there is a sense now, in the wake of the two Paris attacks and other attacks throughout the world, that we may be at a similar critical juncture. And I say that not in any sense having the sometimes American attitude that terrorism is new. Most victims of terrorism are not the victims of 9/11 or the victims of Paris. They are actually victims in the Muslim world. But the reality is that these acts of terrorism are terrible, and they have commanded world attention. So there is a sense for those who are grizzled. I'm not quite as young as Genevieve would have you believe, but I thank her for it. There is a sense among us who lived through the post-9/11 decade, here we go again, that there's a wave of concern, panic, and legislation, this time aimed at what the international community is defining as the foreign terrorist fighter problem. Again, not a problem that is new. Those who fought in the Spanish Civil War might have been characterized as foreign terrorist fighters, but that is the problem that we are confronting. In 2011, I published a book called The 9/11 Effect, and that was really the culmination of my thinking and study, or I thought was the culmination of my thinking and study about the post-9/11 decade. And it concluded that democracies were moving towards many of the security practices of non-democracies, and that included increased use of administrative and military detention. Targeted killing was starting, but Clive Walker, a friend of Genevieve and I, and leading commentator on terrorism, I think joshingly said, well, Kent, when are you going to write a new book called The Islamic State Effect? And the more and more I thought about it, the more and more I thought that Clive's challenge really should be taken up. And so what I'm going to give you tonight is some preliminary thoughts, and I very much look forward to questions and answers, and I will try to leave enough time for questions and answers and criticisms from the audience. So, is this deja vu all over again? One of my central arguments in the 9/11 effect was that we kind of got off to the wrong start with the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council increasingly sets the counterterrorism agenda for, indeed, the entire world. And in the wake of 9/11, the Security Council latched on to the issue of terrorism financing financing for a variety of reasons. One was the most recent international convention in 1999. At that time, concerned the financing of terrorism. There was also bin Laden's somewhat exaggerated reputation as a financier of terrorism. And so 1373 stressed that instrument really above all. And I have developed a critique, and increasingly, as I engaged publicly in Canada's response, I think it's important to engage both at the level of normative concerns about effects on rights, effects on fairness, and the terrorist listing process, which is really quite central to the terrorist financing regime, is an unfair process. It's a process of executive listing on the basis of secret intelligence with no notice to the listed person and with no adversarial challenge. And once the person has been listed, they're not put in jail, but they are subject to asset freezes and travel bans that are quite severe. Another thing that we saw after 9/11, and this arose largely at the Blair government's insistence after the London bombings, was a focus on speech and incitement associated with terrorism. That was a focus for the Blair government at home, but it was also a focus with Security Council Resolution 1624, which was enacted by the UN Security Council in 2005. And as a criminal lawyer, one of the things that I was quite sensitive to was in the immediate wake of 9/11, we lost confidence in the criminal law. We lost confidence in the fact that murder, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, these things have always been crimes, and the criminal trial has been society's most strongest and fairest and most transparent, and in most cases, most legitimate instrument to deal with terrorism. There was in the post 9/11 era this experimentation with less restrained instruments to the criminal sanction. So engaging with this new era, which starts really in 2014, we have to ask ourselves, what is similar? Are we repeating the same mistakes? Has our response been counterproductive? Because after the post 9/11 decade, terrorism, by all the indications, is getting worse, not better. So has our response been counterproductive? I also think we have to take seriously what the threat is. And here, I have to say that I do take the Islamic State threat to all of our democracies, I hope, quite seriously. In fact, it scares me more than Al-Qaeda does. And I think that this presents a greater threat. And so we have to both try to come up with a way that learns from the past, that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past, but also deals with some real differences between the terrorist threat of Al-Qaeda and the terrorist threat of the Islamic State. Now, I probably should never have found Google Pictures, because there are all sorts of fun things that you can find. And one of the things that I would very much value your input is whether this metaphor of counterterrorism at the Crossroads is a compelling one, because it's one that I'm still not yet 100% convinced, but let's say I'm 90% there. So as Genevieve said, I'm going to try to point out two different paths that I think democracies can go upon. And as Genevieve said, I actually think that it is probably more likely that we are going to follow the darker, more dangerous path. So the dangerous path is, it seems to me, that we are much closer to what Samuel Huntington, before 9/11, very provocatively said would be a coming clash of civilizations. That there is a sense of warlike attitudes in Europe, perhaps even more than in the United States now. There is a blurring in this country, and I've been teaching in this country since January, and it's been very instructive to see how there is a blurring between the problem of violent extremism, which is one that the UN has signaled should be addressed, and what I see as a somewhat separate issue of extremism. So the Cameron government has very much focused on this issue of extremism. And one of the things that I've learned as a comparative lawyer is that what the UK does in terms of counterterrorism is very important. It is much more, in my view, influential than what the United States does. Shortly after 9/11, I was asked to go to Indonesia, and this was before the Bali bombings, and I was asked to advise the Indonesians on whether they needed a new counterterrorism law. And it was very interesting, because the young Indonesians who met me said, looks like an American, talks like an American, you're going to bring us the Patriot Act. And my response to them was, I couldn't bring you the Patriot Act if I wanted to, right? American legalism has become so technical and so hyper that the Patriot Act, which in some ways was vastly overblown, a lot of the bad stuff that happened under Bush had very little to do with the Patriot Act. But what I told the young Indonesians who were worried about their new and fragile democracy in a post-Suharto era was, what you had to worry about was the Terrorism Act 2000. Because the UK's Terrorism Act 2000, after 9/11, migrated throughout not just the Commonwealth, although it certainly migrated through the Commonwealth, but there are echoes picked out virtually throughout the world. And so one of the things that I want to argue fairly strongly tonight is that this new focus that the Cameron government has on extremism is going to be picked up by other countries. Indeed, I'm going to suggest it has already been picked up by China. Okay? So part of this dangerous path is a path towards a kind of constant suspicion of both Muslim and migrant populations, and a conflation of those two different problems. A reliance on less restrained, less transparent, less legitimate instruments, alternatives to the criminal sanctions, such as control orders, no-fly listing, targeting, killing, and a sense that democratic citizenship is something to be denied and taken away, and not something that is a common resource and makes us actually stronger. So that's a bit of a downer. Yeah, but what about a brighter path? And the brighter path that I can see, and I approach this as a criminal law scholar who has long had a kind of skepticism about the criminal sanction. So in the post 9/11 era, I was in a somewhat awkward position in that I often defended the criminal law as a fairer, more restrained alternative to military detention, military trial, administrative detention, targeted killing, and I do, right? So the focus on that has made me appreciate the virtues of the criminal law, perhaps more than I've had. But when I teach my first-year criminal law course to Canadian students, I don't teach the criminal sanction as the panacea. I mean, it's kind of a necessary evil. But if we can do more by way of crime prevention, if we can do more by way of restorative justice, these are constructive alternatives to the criminal sanction. So the nub, or the glimmer of brightness that I see in our new debate about foreign fighters is the sheer size of the foreign fighter problem is making us discuss, although we often don't use this language because it's seen as airy-fairy and apologetic, we are actually discussing the causes of terrorism. And we are discussing rehabilitation of people who have been attracted and involved in terrorism in a way that was simply absent in the post-9/11 era. We're not doing this through benevolence. We are doing this simply because the size of the problem has increased to an extent where we can no longer ignore these, in my view, critical issues about causes, prevention, and rehabilitation. Now, I say this advisedly because one of the things I've really been struck with the 3 months that I've been able to spend in the UK is how the PREVENT program here has really become a kind of dirty word, right? And I'm going to talk about some of the concerns, some of the real concerns that Muslim communities and others have about the PREVENT program. But if there is a brighter path, I think that the idea of having a countering violent extremism program that maybe isn't the PREVENT program, that isn't the extremism strategy, is part of the brighter future. And then, again, we also have the migrant crisis. I think the migrant crisis in Europe provides an opportunity as well as a possibility of things going horribly wrong. But the opportunity is not all of the migrants, but some of the migrants are victims of the Islamic State. We don't often talk about it that way, but a response to the migrants, a open, brave, welcoming response, but also one that makes clear that democratic citizenship is pluralistic, but, involves no violence, right? I mean, that's, we don't care why you might commit violence. That's where democracies draw the line. And so I do think that there is a sense that the migrant crisis provides an opportunity. Now, I realize as a Canadian, it's perhaps easier for me to say this than if I was a European. But I'm obviously influenced by the Canadian government's response, which I'll talk about, where our new Prime Minister has made an argument that we shouldn't be scared of refugees, migrants. We should embrace them, welcome them, and see that as part of our international responsibility. Again, I know that it is obviously more intense and somewhat different here in Europe. The last thing I want to say by way of the Crossroads metaphor is here I go again. So throughout my scholarly life, metaphors have gotten me in trouble. And Crossroads is, I do recognize now that Crossroads is a metaphor. And so, I don't think that this is something where it really is a fork in the road like the picture suggests. I think we're going to pursue both paths simultaneously, but it is a question of emphasis. But really, throughout my academic career, for better or for worse, I felt that simplified ideal models have both a descriptive and a normative purpose. And so that's one of my reasons why I'm trying to gather at least two different models from where we will go from here. Although I do frankly recognize that we're going to pursue them both, and probably others that frankly I cannot imagine now. So let's talk just a little bit about the issue of threat. I'm not sure exactly where this picture of Osama bin Laden comes from, but it's kind of interesting, right? I wouldn't say we should be nostalgic about bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, but it is a very different, I think, terrorist group than the Islamic State. So there was a sense that there was a secret inner group. There was often a focus on the far enemy. And the Islamic State, although it does have aspects of focusing on the far enemy, i.e. the enemy on the West, is actually committing, genocide against other Muslims that don't believe in its particular very fundamentalist end of days version of Islam. But Al-Qaeda was, very much a kind of secretive inner group. The Islamic State is quite different. So there's a much greater social media presence. There's a much greater recruiting presence. So there's an idea that the Islamic State is much more populous. If anyone can come to areas of Iraq and Syria that it occupies, it seems like the Islamic State will welcome you. Focus on the near enemy, often Shia in Iraq and Syria, a declaration of a caliphate, and also a focus on kind of end of days. Geopolitically, we don't have full information about what the Islamic State has, but we know that they have been able to seize oil wells, other assets. It's disputed how much. It's disputed how much oil they're able to sell to Syria and other countries. But this is different than Al-Qaeda, which even with the bombing of Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda's geopolitical influence in Afghanistan was much less than the Islamic State's influence in Iraq and Syria. And so we've seen, perhaps most viscerally, in France, a country that, like Canada, did not participate in the Iraqi invasion, which I think many people think really set off a complex chain of events that has resulted in the rise of the Islamic State. But even France now is seeing itself very much at war with the Islamic State. So more populous, more concentrated, and that provides I think a real difference. The Soufan Group in December 2015 updated their estimate of the number of people in the Islamic State from 12,000 to between 27,000 and 31,000 people have left over 80 countries to join the Islamic State. This I think, is a threat that cannot be ignored. I'm not saying it's an existential threat, but it is a serious threat. And I think in some ways it is a more serious threat than Al-Qaeda, and one that could potentially do much more damage to democracies. So how is the world responding? Well, as I said, we know that the UN Security Council often sets the agenda. I've talked a little bit about how I think the Security Council made some pretty fundamental mistakes post 9/11, focusing on terrorism financing, largely ignoring questions of rights, also ignoring questions of how terrorism is defined. So what that meant is it gave each nation state an ability to define terrorism in its own ways. And in repressive regimes especially, terrorism has been defined extremely broadly and often in a way that threatens freedom. So what's happening with the Islamic State? Well, the critical Security Council resolution, so the parallel to Security Council Resolution 1373 is Security Council Resolution 2178. 2014. This is a more elaborate, a more sophisticated resolution than Security Council Resolution 1373, which was enacted literally while the fires were still burning in the rubble of the World Trade Center. It's about 8 pages. I think 1373 was 3 pages. 2178, to its credit, makes a lot more reference to the need to respect international human rights. 1373 made almost no reference at all to international human rights. Having said that, though, 2178 doubles down on terrorist listing. And to me, this is somewhat baffling. Why? Because we know through the Qadi case and other cases throughout the world that the listing process has been subject to many successful due process challenges. And also the difference, I mean, how are you going to list 30,000 people who have joined IS? Listing at the best of times, like prescription, is a process that is 1 or 2 steps behind the terrorist phenomena. When you're dealing with a mass phenomena, listing seems almost impossible. And so if you look at the UN list, if you look at the 1267 list, and I'm sure that they're trying to add more names, there's hardly any IS names. There's hardly been any updates to that list. Yet the UN seems to think that's the only thing we have, so let's kind of affirm it. And then even more shockingly, 2253, and both of these resolutions are enacted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, so they're meant to be a mandatory measure related to world peace. In the wake of the second Paris attacks, in Security Council Resolution 2253, 99 paragraphs, almost all of which are devoted to listing and terrorism finance and travel bans. And the Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee is now renamed the ISIL-Daesh and Al-Qaeda Committee. So ISIL, the Islamic State, gets first billing. This new resolution, enacted in December of last year, incorporates Financial Action Task Force documents that, when you actually read them, are incredibly pessimistic about the ability to stop the financing of the Islamic State, especially when people who are recruited to the Islamic State bring their money across the border. This is not to say that terrorism financing has no role to play with respect to the Islamic State, and particularly with respect to things like the marketing of antiquities, the marketing of oil. But it does seem somewhat strange that the UN is so fixated on an instrument that has both legitimacy and due process problems, but also has efficacy problems. So what is new in Security Council Resolution 2178? Well, there's 4 paragraphs that speak to the issue of CVE, or what in the UK might be called prevent. And those paragraphs recognize that there's a role for local communities, non-government actors to counter violent extremism, doesn't talk about extremism, and to promote social inclusion and cohesion and peaceful conflict resolution. The UN Secretary General has subsequently issued a more elaborate document with respect to CVE. This is really the only new game in town. What about Europe's response? Well, the Council of Europe has come up with a new protocol that will add foreign terrorist fighter offenses. And this is something that we're going to see throughout the world. Canada also added new foreign terrorist fighter offenses. But there's a real question how much this actually adds, right? That if financing of terrorism, training for terrorism, participation in a terrorist group was illegal, then adding new foreign terrorist fighter offenses may be simply criminalizing conduct that was already criminal. There may be no particular harm with respect to rights, but it really doesn't address the issue. The Council of Europe, however, also has, I think, a very interesting action plan about multidisciplinary and community-based CVE. And if you haven't looked at it, I think it is worth a look. I think it is very consistent with the UN Secretary General's plan. But one of the things that the Council of Europe doesn't look at is how does the hard criminalization of the new offenses, how does that interact with the softer countering violent extremism rehabilitation? Because, of course, the harder edge suggests that all of this is criminal, where the softer edge is partly about trying to prevent people avoiding the criminal sanction both with respect to prospective terrorist foreign fighters and for return foreign terrorist fighters. So I really think that the issue of the emphasis between the hard strategies and the soft strategies is actually going to be quite critical. Most recently, last week, March 11th, the EU ministers proposed a new terrorism directive. This is the EU as opposed to the Council of Europe. I'm slowly learning the differences. I know many North Americans miss it. Maybe I still miss it. But one of the troubling things in the new EU directive, which will now go to the European Parliament, is it proposes to expand the offense of provocation of terrorism to include the glorification of terrorism. There is some language about press freedom, but it is optional. Again, a stress on new foreign terrorist fighter offenses, which may not do any particular harm, but may not add very much. And there's also a provision that says whatever investigative powers are given to organized crime, to combat organized crime, should also be available for terrorism offenses. So almost a kind of encouragement of this blur, right? That, once ideas get introduced in one area, they are often introduced in many areas. So those are kind of the supranational agendas. They set forth both a hard strategy of criminalization, increased listing to deal with foreign terrorist fighters, but also a kind of more innovative, somewhat softer, countering violent extremism. What are countries on the ground actually doing? This is a book I wrote with a colleague, Craig Forsays, which dealt with Canada's response to 2 terrorist acts in October of 2014 that ended in 2 deaths, but had a huge psychological impact on Canadians and Canadian parliamentarians, because one of the terrorists, after he killed an unarmed soldier who was standing guard at the War Memorial in Ottawa, was then able to enter the center block of our Parliament buildings, and that's a picture of our Parliament buildings, was able to enter that building and come within feet of where the Prime Minister and his caucus and the leader of the opposition and his caucus were meeting. And if he had something more lethal than a hunting rifle, this could have been something that would have been on the scale of the second Paris attack, but would have involved the murder of potentially many of Canada's legislators. So although the body count was not very high, it had a huge impact in my country. And so Canada responded with 3 new major pieces of legislation. Again, we see we added a 15th terrorism offense to our criminal code. We had 14. The new offense is advocacy of terrorism offenses in general. I still don't really know what that means, but there you have that. We put the no-fly list and passport suspension on a legislative footing, which I think is a good idea, but we also allow secret intelligence that is not only never seen by the listed person, but potentially is never subject to any adversarial challenge to be used as the basis of putting someone on one of those lists. We increased the ability to get peace bonds, which is kind of the Canadian version of control orders, that is orders that don't require proof of criminal guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but put restraints on the liberty of the individual in the community. We gave our version of MI5 a lot of new powers, powers of foreign surveillance, a new privilege that will apply to all of the security services informers, new information sharing powers, really very large, and new executive action or disruption powers. So basically, we changed the mandate of our security intelligence agency from one that was deliberately designed purely to limit them to the collection of intelligence to actually take physical steps to reduce threats to the security of Canada. If those threats involve violations of the law or they involve violations of rights under our Bill of Rights, the Canadian Charter, they require a judicial warrant. But this was really a kind of tough sort of approach with respect to terrorism. It was also accompanied by a law on stripping citizenship of people that had been involved with terrorism only if they were dual nationals. There was a law against barbaric cultural practice. There was a lot of activity. The Liberals in opposition, who are now the government, actually supported the bill, but said that once they were in power, they would amend its more problematic aspects. It has moved forward on one of those promises, and there is a bill now before the Canadian Parliament to repeal citizenship stripping provisions. So just while the rest of the world seems to be moving towards citizenship stripping, obviously the French example, Canada is moving towards repealing citizenship stripping. I think that that's the right thing to do. I support Bill C6, partly because citizenship stripping is only going to apply to some who have a dual nationality. And second, it's not, I mean, it's a symbolic, expressive, feel-good sanction. It's not one that actually works, because most convicted terrorists, if you take away their citizenship in Canada or the UK, where are you going to send them? Are you going to send them to Syria? Are you going to send them to Egypt? Probably not. The Australians, very much the same story. There's been an interesting kind of dialogue between Australia and Canada. We borrowed the Australian advocacy of terrorism offenses offense, even though Australia doesn't have a constitutional Bill of Rights. They've now borrowed our approach to citizenship stripping with the Citizenship Allegiance to Australian Act 2015. The minister lists 11 different international law rights that would be adversely affected by this law. It's almost as if that was the point of the enactment of the law. This was supported by both the official opposition and the Liberal majority in Australia. Also expanding their security services powers introducing a new offense of being in a declared zone, which is a form of terrorist fighters' offense. What about in this country? Well, the Counterterrorism and Security Act 2015 enhances control orders, puts prevent obligations on many sectors, including schools and universities, and comes up, reinforces citizenship stripping and exclusion orders. But again, I would point out that actually implementing citizenship stripping is, I think, going to often be very difficult. We have the countering extremism strategy, which goes beyond the UN's focus on violent extremism and talks about extremism, talks about possible new legislation that would give powers to disrupt and prescribe extremist groups. I assume that that's on hold until after the referendum, because it seems like everything else is. But this is something that I think is quite worrying. In France, we've obviously had a declaration of an emergency, which has been extended into May. So, concerns about a permanent emergency. Amnesty International reported at the end of January over 3,000 searches conducted without judicial authorization under the emergency laws. 350 people had been assigned residence orders by the end of January 2016. So like control orders, like Canadian peace bonds, these are orders that do not require criminal proof and only restrict the person in this case to up to 12 hours in basically subject to a curfew. One of the interesting things about the French residence orders is that they are often based on note blanche prepared by the intelligence agencies, again, not subject to adversarial challenge. So as we move to these alternatives to the criminal process, there is going to be more false positives. And I think that that does raise questions about alienation of Muslim communities, recognizing that the French Muslim community is quite specific. Citizenship stripping in France, to my surprise, has actually already been upheld with respect to naturalized French citizens by the Constitutional Council in France, but there is now a very controversial, divisive debate in France about expanding this out. Over 3,000 searches, but according to Amnesty International, only 25 criminal investigations started, 21 of them related to apology of terrorism, which is basically defending terrorism in a speech act. I mentioned China. At the end of December 2015, China came out with a major new anti-terrorism law. It obviously has many distinct Chinese features, but it also takes much from modern, i.e. UK terrorism laws. So there's an offense against advocacy of terrorism, there's a form of control orders, there's a requirement that corporations decrypt and take down material that promotes either terrorism or extremism. So like the Cameron government's extremism strategy, the Chinese have gone a step further and actually created new crimes of extremism, as well as putting prevent-style duties on many agencies, including prisons. So when you look at all of this legislation, I think a few themes come out, that we're moving more and more towards less restrained alternatives to the criminal sanctions. And this has what Craig Forsees and I have called the Goldilocks Problem. Right? The Goldilocks problem is community sanctions, control orders, are going to be too weak for determined terrorists. The fact that you have to be at home for 12 hours is not going to prevent you from committing a terrorist atrocity if that's really what you're going to do. But they will also be too strong for others who have no idea, who have no inclination to do it. And when people breach these control orders, we're going to have enforcement issues about, did you have access to the internet? Were you home for a curfew? Seems to me that if we want to discredit terrorism, we have to focus on the violence inherent in terrorism. Another problem with these less restrained alternatives is that they all allow some form of secret intelligence to be used as evidence to impose legal consequences on individuals. I'm not opposed to intelligence, but intelligence is, in its essence, information that is supposed to warn government about security threats and allow governments to take preventive actions. When intelligence, where intelligence agencies will go to the mat to make sure we don't know sources or methods of the collection of their intelligence. The problem is when intelligence is used to impose legal consequences on people, we have material of unknown reliability. Much of the law of evidence is about what is the source and what is the method that the information is collected. And so this use of intelligence as evidence can both harm people, and it also can also potentially harm the intelligence agency's ability to collect, to the extent that affected people will eventually or perhaps get access to sources and methods. Now, here you're going to find I kind of go soft on the United States. I know I have somewhat of an American accent, but it really seems to me, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz notwithstanding, that the Americans are, of all the democracies, the ones that are not freaking out. And again, this fits into a kind of controversial thesis that many people have, including myself, about American exceptionalism. So stripping citizenship is not being seriously considered. Maybe under Trump, it might be. But most people in the United States say that is inherently unconstitutional. There's no point talking about it. First Amendment culture, as opposed to Europe, where there is a less robust protection of freedom of expression. So there's not much interest in punishing glorification of terrorism, speech associated with terrorism. There has not been the enactment of new criminal laws. The existing material support laws, which are certainly not without their problems, have been active. So the United States actually stands out, despite this fellow, as a country that is, I think, somewhat exceptional. Now, it may simply be a matter of time, but I have to say that both after Boston and after San Bernardino, I expected the Americans to react more irrationally than they actually have. But that's something that I'd be happy to take questions on. Just kind of wrapping up, because I do want to leave some time for questions. The kind of the dark vision of where we are heading is one that really sees this kind of blurring between war and crime. And of course, the U.S. was the guilty party after 9/11. And so you see in Guantanamo and in the Military Commissions Act this kind of selective picking and choosing between war concepts and crime concepts, always picking concepts that are enabling for the state and that take the most away from the terrorist suspect. But now we're seeing warlike imagery come to Europe. And, if we are at war, who are the enemy aliens? And what is going to happen to them? Hence my concern about a kind of clash of civilization. If you look at the renaming of the UN 1267 committee to include ISIS, is this simply a kind of Schmittian sense of saying who your enemies are? Are we seeing what a German legal theorist has called enemy criminal law? So criminal law that we would not apply to ourselves, but we're happy to apply to the enemy. And that will lose the force of traditional criminal law. And are we seeing a selective use of terrorism powers, terrorism labels, to focus on Islamic terrorism and not to focus on right-wing violence? These are all issues, threats to speech. So finally, in kind of ending, because I really think that this is going to be the key, is what's going to happen with CVE. So I think I've probably laid out for you a lot of the bad things that I see coming and that are happening now. Now, again, I go back to the fact that CVE and PREVENT has a very bad reputation in this country and has been implemented in ways that I find quite scary, right? So as you may have gathered, as a child, I had a severe speech impediment. And there's been two stories that have happened since I've been here in the UK that have really kind of shaken me. One is this little kid, little Muslim kid, who told his teachers, "We live in a terrace house." But they thought he was saying, "We live in a terrorist house." So he was reported. And then just 2 days ago, there was a little kid who was talking about cucumber, and they thought he was saying cooker bomb. Maybe he had, a a real speech impediment as I did. But it seems like those stories, right, although I notice no one's laughing, because, I mean, these are things that are happening to the Muslim community here in the UK. And so, you know, if CVE goes wrong, if it's dominated by security agencies, if even a multidisciplinary approach to CVE, which I think is right in theory, I think in theory we don't want simply the police and the security services doing this work. We want schools, we want health professionals to do this work. But I'm a bit chastened by the fact that, you know, teachers who are not malevolent people, they have these new prevent duties. And they thought they had little kids that said, I lived in a terrorist house. There's a cooker bomb. So they called the state. Although I think in theory, there is much to be said about decentering the reliance on security agencies to deliver CVE. I think when the police or the intelligence communities are relied upon, as they largely have been in Canada, to deliver CVE, they're kind of in a no-win position, because the people that are dealing with them know that these are people who have the power to either charge them criminally or to develop intelligence that will then have them put on a no-fly list or put on some other list. So I really think that much of the story in the next couple of years is whether we can get CVE right. And here I actually do say that I hold out some hope for a kind of North American approach to CVE, which leaves kind of, extremist views alone, because it's thought that that is protected freedom of expression. I think some of the problem with CVE, and you're seeing this at universities, is that we are focusing on extremist ideas as opposed to violence. And, what I fear is that is going to lead to a situation where the debate just shuts down. So, if you're a Muslim high school student or even a Muslim university student, do you want to express perhaps ideas about Israel and the Middle East that people will find to be extreme? Well, I would understand if people say, well, in that kind of environment, I'm just not going to speak out. But it seems to me that if you go back to 2178, they talk about not eliminating extremism, which seems to be what the Cameron government wants to do. I don't think it's possible. I don't particularly think it's desirable even to eliminate extremism. But 2178 talks about peaceful avenues for extremist views, grievances. And it also talks about a kind of positive, right? That I think what democracies have to do is, rather than send just a negative message about extremism, they have to sell a positive message about what democracies have to offer. And I think that the migrant crisis actually gives us an opportunity to sell that very, very positive message. So if there is any bright spot, it really is going to be on the CVE front. And here, I think, obviously, Muslim communities, are they an object? Are they the subject? How are our relations with incredibly diverse Muslim communities? I think this is going to be one of the critical issues in the years ahead. And I think that there's plenty of room. I may very well misunderstand. I think all of us can misunderstand these sorts of relations. And then the last thing is we also have to really look at whether we still believe in the issue of rehabilitation. So people who have gone to Iraq and Syria, who have perhaps been attracted to the Islamic State, some of these people are coming home. And what's going to happen? Are we going to develop knowledge and expertise about issues of rehabilitation? Or I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in this country with the Aitchison review into prisons. So it seems to me that things have changed. So ISIS is a new threat. There are elements of making the same mistakes that we made after 9/11. I think the focus on terrorism financing and listing is a prime example. But we do have some new instruments, and I think CVE is a very important new instrument. The other new instruments we're seeing is more reliance on less restrained alternatives to the criminal sanction. So the negative view, right, the dark road is one of increased anti-Muslim and migrant settlement, negative messaging about all forms of extremism, which seems to go right down to nursery school, a kind of militant democracy response, which will burden speech and religion and cut down on debate, increased use of derogations, emergencies, and war rhetoric. This is a very scary scenario. This is a scenario of a clash of civilizations that will, regardless of what the outcome, deeply, deeply harm and change our democracies. And as Genevieve said at the beginning, she thinks this one's more likely. I probably believe that this is more likely. But as you get older, they say you try to become a little bit more optimistic, or at least my wife tells me I have to become a bit more optimistic. So what's the way forward? Well, the way forward is we are now, if only because of the size of the problem, we are indirectly talking about causes. We're talking about prevention, and we're talking about rehabilitation. Yes, the security services, the police, prosecutors, courts, these are important responders. I'm not saying we shouldn't do this. In fact, I think the criminal trial has a very important place in delegitimizing violence, that no motive justifies violence. But I also think teachers, doctors, corporations, Muslim civil society, this is also part of the problem. As the UN has recognized, this is not a problem that can be solved simply through prosecutions or simply through the use of military force. And of course, the migrant crisis provides us an opportunity to demonstrate what it is that democracies can do. So those are some of the choices. They're probably not as extreme as I laid out, but that is what I think lies ahead of us. And I thank you very much for your attention.